Before I was a writer, I was a reader, a prolific reader. But when I started writing, reading became a struggle for me. In this week's episode, I'm going to talk about that. I'm Michael Laron, and this is the Writer's Journey podcast, where you get a window into the life of a working science fiction and fantasy author. I'm on a mission to go from nobody to bestseller, and I'm documenting every step of the way. Tune in every week as I share my progress and discover what inspires my books and how I write them. You can find the show notes for today's episode at michaellaron.com/podcast. This week, I'm talking about the writing life. Hello and welcome to episode 30. I want to talk this week about writing versus reading because for me, it's a constant struggle. I was a prolific reader before I started writing professionally. I read at least 200 books or so a year. In fact, I co-hosted a podcast where I talked about the books I was reading. It was called the To Be Read Podcast, and we did over 100 episodes talking about the books we loved. That show was cool because it forced me to keep reading so I could have something to talk about every week. I'll drop a link to it in the show notes. I was also active at my local library. Des Moines, Iowa has a great library system, so I used it for interlibrary loans, and I use Overdrive to check out a lot of ebooks and audiobooks. And of course, don't get me started on Amazon. I bought books practically every week, so much that it was becoming a problem. Ask my wife. Pretty much, if I wanted to find a book, I could find it, and I read a lot of books that were outside of the mainstream. That's why I think I approach writing differently than others. When I decided to become a professional writer, however, it became very difficult to balance writing with reading. After all, I still had a full-time job to worry about, and night classes, and a family to raise. And I found that I had to keep up with a lot of podcasts and blogs in order to be successful at writing. So naturally, reading fell by the wayside for me, which is something I hate and it dogs me literally every day. I still read, but not at the level I used to. If I'm lucky, I read maybe 50 books a year, which is pitiful if you knew how much I used to read. So when I become more successful in my career, I've always said that I'll use the extra time to read and consume. I write plenty of novels per year, and writing quantity is not a problem for me. If I can ever put myself in a position where I'm writing full-time, I've always said that I'll be a full-time reader and keep the amount of writing I do the same. I've tried to cut down on my word counts and read more, but I always get anxious when I'm not writing. I'm always striving for personal bests, so to write less just makes me lose sleep. I've also adopted audiobooks as my primary listening vehicle, listening when I'm in the car, to and from work, and doing chores. But that still doesn't quite replace the time lost. Writing versus reading is one of the biggest struggles I believe that writers have to deal with, finding the time to read when writing is your primary job. I know you can't write if you don't read, but if you don't write, you don't have a career. So it's a difficult balance, at least for me. But I'm committed to reading. It's how I got my start. Reading for me is like writing. It's as sacred as prayer. It's how I discover the inner workings of other people and learn my own inner workings. But boy, it's not easy to read when you're a writer, and definitely something I wish someone had told me when I started writing. I suppose nothing in life is perfect. This kind of balance struggle is what keeps life interesting, you know? If it was a struggle between writing and reading, it would be something else. So I've just learned to live with the discomfort, and I make sure that I do enjoy the little time I have to read. Thanks for joining me this week. If you enjoyed the show, here are a couple ways to help a brother out. If you're listening to this on Anchor, favorite the show. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, do me a favor and write me a review and share it with your friends. You can of course visit my website and learn more about my work at michaellaron.com. If you have a question, send me a voice message on Anchor and you just might hear it on the show. Next week, I'll be reading a page from my writer's sketchbook. Until then, I leave you with a quote. Reading is to the mind what exercise is to the body. Joseph Addison.